Cardiomyocytes, or muscle cells of the heart, function a little bit different than skeletal muscle. And the mechanisms that they use to function a little bit differently actually help protect the heart. So, first, let's take a look at the timing of the action potential and then sort of muscle contraction in a skeletal muscle. So remember, we start down here at rest, we get this action potential, then the cell hyperpolarizes, and then it goes back to rest, right? So that is sort of the graph of the voltage changes in a skeletal muscle cell. Now, if we were to look at force, right, we stay stable during this pretty much entire action potential, and then we generate our force way over here. Okay, so then it goes back to rest. So this is going to be our force of our muscle. Okay, so notice that we have the entirety of the action potential occurs, okay, and then you get the actual twitch of the muscle, right? Because remember, when we talked about skeletal muscle, we had sort of that latency period. Okay, now if we look at this same sort of graph where we simultaneously graph the voltage changes and force over time in a cardiomyocyte, let's put skeletal muscle over here just so we know. We can keep these two separate. So we'll say skeletal muscles over here, and then we'll put cardiac muscle over here. Now, the first thing we have to understand is that cardiac muscle functions a little bit differently in that the cells will hit that threshold value and they'll depolarize using sodium channels just like the other cells we've talked about, and then they'll start to repolarize, and then you get this what's called a plateau phase where it sort of looks like this, like so. Okay, and this right here, this phase from here to here is sort of known as the plateau phase. Plateau. Okay, and that's caused by calcium channels opening up and an influx of calcium. So you have the resting membrane potential, right? Then you've got massive influx of sodium, okay, the massive depolarization event, and then the cell starts to repolarize, but as it does, these voltage-gated calcium channels open up and calcium influxes into the cell, and you get this prolonged period of depolarization. Now, because of that, remember that these voltage-gated sodium channels can't open up until their gates reset, right? So we have this refractory period. You have the absolute refractory period during this time here. Hey, you have the refractory period here as well, right? But notice that the muscle twitch happens after the refractory period. In cardiac muscle, if we graph sort of the muscle twitch, we get something like this. Okay, notice here that our muscle twitch and the force occurs within that refractory period, right? And so because of that, the muscle cell is relaxed before the muscle cell comes out of that refractory period. So if we look at our skeletal muscle, we can send another action potential right here, right? Here, we can't send another action potential until over here, right? So because of that, in our skeletal muscle, we can get these individual twitches where we can say the muscle is going to contract and we send another action potential before it even relaxes, and we can get this wave summation and we can get to what we refer to as tetanus. Okay. Now, inside of our cardiac muscle cell, notice the muscle cell is relaxed before we have the opportunity to send another action potential. So this plateau phase, the plateau phase in cardiomyocytes prevents tetanus, okay, which is good. That's a good thing, right? Because now our muscle cells have to contract and then they have to relax. They have to contract, they have to relax, right? If we were to reach tetanus in our cardiomyocytes, they would just hit this sustained contracted condition, and then they would never relax and the heart wouldn't actually beat and it wouldn't do its job. Okay, so once we get this action potential inside of the muscle cell, it's going to sort of do the same things that the skeletal muscle cells are going to do. It's going to release calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's going to bind to troponin, move tropomyosin. Myosin's going to bind, right? All of those steps sort of follow in suit. So now, one of the things that's a little bit confusing if you are thinking about this from a holistic perspective is think about you have your cardiomyocyte. This is the cardiomyocyte membrane. And then you still have T-tubules like you do inside of skeletal muscle. And you still have that sarcoplasmic reticulum where the calcium is going to come from, right? Now, if this stays sort of up here in this voltaged area, right, you might be thinking, well, why doesn't calcium just sort of stick around this whole time if the membrane potential is elevated? Well, what we have to remember is that we're generating that action potential here, right? And then it has to move or propagate along the muscle cell membrane down into this T-tubule. Then it has to activate the DHP receptor, which has to activate the Rye receptor, right? So as this sort of undergoes that plateau phase, right, it's going to propagate down and we're going to release that calcium. Now, calcium is going to get released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? And it's going to stick around, right? And then eventually it's going to get pumped by the calcium ATPase back into that sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? And that pumping of that calcium back into that sarcoplasmic reticulum is happening during that relaxation phase, during that phase here. So we're going to move that calcium back into that sarcoplasmic reticulum, right, as we start to shut those calcium channels on the cell membrane, right? But the other thing that we have to remember is that the influx of calcium, right, is local and it sits here, right? And so as it comes in during that plateau phase, we're going to start to hit that point where it's getting pumped back into that sarcoplasmic reticulum and the muscle can relax, right? So we have to sort of separate these two entities from one another to say, well, why doesn't that calcium just sort of stick around, right? It's because all of this stuff sort of happens within milliseconds, fractionally, and a lot of it is happening simultaneously, okay? So your muscle is beginning to relax, right? At about the same time, those calcium channels are starting to close. And because of that, you get the depolarization during the same time as the relaxation, right? And then we have to generate another action potential, go through those processes again to get that secondary switch. Right, with the skeletal muscle system, right, we have the action potential, we have it propagate down the membrane, sort of activate, and the calcium comes free, right, and then we're going to start to do all of the stuff, right, but by the time this is happening, we're already sending more action potentials. We can't do that inside of our cardiac muscle, and because of that, that's what that plateau phase does to prevent tetanus. And that's why your cardiac muscle cells don't really enter that tetanus contraction.